The desert wind carried the sound of gunfire across the barren landscape as 12 Navy SEALs found themselves trapped in what would become known as one of the most desperate firefights in modern military history. Surrounded by over 40 enemy fighters in the mountains of Afghanistan, their ammunition running dangerously low, these elite warriors faced a situation that seemed impossible to survive. But sometimes, when hope appears lost and death seems certain, a single shot can change everything. Sometimes, the most unlikely hero emerges from the shadows to turn the tide of battle. And sometimes that hero is a 24-year-old female Marine sniper whose steady hands and sharp eyes would prove that courage knows no gender. This is the true story of how Sergeant Maria Santos saved 12 of America's finest warriors and redefined what it means to be a guardian angel on the battlefield. It's a story that the military tried to keep quiet, but one that deserves to be told, because when bullets fly and lives hang in the balance, only one thing matters: who has the skill and courage to pull the trigger when it counts most. The morning of September 15th, 2018, started like any other day at Forward Operating Base Chapman in eastern Afghanistan. The sun rose over the Rocky Mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded the soldiers of home. But for Navy SEAL Team 6, this would be anything but an ordinary day. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison had been leading special operations missions for 8 years, but something about this particular assignment felt different. The intelligence reports were sketchy at best, and the target location, a remote compound nestled high in the Hindu Kush Mountains, had been the site of unusual activity for weeks. Local informants spoke of foreign fighters gathering there, planning something big. The briefing room was thick with tension as Morrison addressed his 11-man team. They were hunting a high-value target known only as the Engineer, a bomb maker responsible for dozens of attacks across the region. According to intelligence, he would be meeting with other terrorist leaders at the mountain compound to plan their next major operation. What they didn't know was that their mission had been compromised from the very beginning. A Taliban informant had infiltrated the local intelligence network and had been feeding information back to the enemy for months. Every detail of the SEALs' planned assault was already known by the fighters waiting in the mountains. Meanwhile, 2 miles away from the main base, Marine Sergeant Maria Santos was conducting her own routine patrol. At 24 years old, she had already earned a reputation as one of the finest snipers in the Corps. Growing up in rural Texas, she had learned to shoot before she could properly tie her shoes, spending countless hours hunting with her grandfather on their family ranch. Santos had volunteered for her 3rd deployment to Afghanistan against the wishes of her family, who worried about their daughter serving in one of the most dangerous regions in the world. But Maria had a calling that went beyond family concerns. She believed deeply in protecting her fellow service members and bringing stability to a war-torn nation. Her sniper team consisted of 3 Marines, herself as the primary shooter, Corporal David Shunn as her spotter, and Lance Corporal Tommy Williams as their communications specialist and security. They had been tasked with providing overwatch for a supply convoy that was scheduled to pass through the valley later that day. As the SEALs prepared for their helicopter insertion, Santos and her team were already moving into position on a rocky outcrop that provided excellent visibility across the entire valley. She carefully set up her Barrett M82.50 caliber rifle, a weapon capable of accurate fire at distances exceeding a mile. The rifle had been her companion through dozens of missions, and she trusted it like an old friend. The morning air was crisp and clear, perfect conditions for long-range shooting. Santos methodically checked her equipment, adjusting her scope and calculating wind speed and direction. Chun lay beside her with high-powered binoculars, scanning the terrain for any signs of enemy activity. At 0800 hours, 2 Black Hawk helicopters lifted off from FOB Chapman, carrying Morrison's team toward their target. The flight would take them deep into enemy territory, to a landing zone that intelligence had assured them was clear of hostile forces. The SEALs checked their weapons one final time as the aircraft banked toward the mountains. From her position, Santos watched the helicopters disappear into the distance. She had no idea that she would soon be the only thing standing between those men and certain death. The SEAL insertion went according to plan initially. The helicopters dropped the team at a landing zone approximately 3 kilometers from their target, in a small valley surrounded by steep cliffs. The aircraft departed quickly, leaving the 12 warriors alone in hostile territory with nothing but their training, their weapons, and their trust in each other. Morrison divided his team into 3 four-man elements. Alpha Element, led by Morrison himself, would approach the compound from the north. Bravo Element, under the command of Chief Petty Officer Rick Martinez, would circle around to cut off any escape routes to the south. Charlie Element, led by Petty Officer First Class Mike Thompson, would provide overwatch and fire support from an elevated position. The terrain was brutal, loose rock and steep inclines that made silent movement nearly impossible. Each step had to be carefully planned to avoid sending rocks tumbling down the mountainside, potentially alerting the enemy to their presence. The SEALs moved like ghosts, using every bit of cover the harsh landscape provided. As they approached the target compound, something felt wrong to Morrison. The building looked too quiet, too empty. Where were the guards that intelligence had reported? Why was there no movement visible through the windows? His instincts, honed by years of combat experience, were screaming that this was a trap. At that same moment, Santos was tracking movement through her scope on the opposite side of the valley. What she saw made her blood run cold. Dozens of armed fighters were moving into position around the landing zone where the SEALs had been dropped off. They had been waiting, hiding in caves and behind rocks, ready to spring their ambush. "David, we've got a major problem," she whispered to Chun. "Count at least 40 hostiles moving to surround the LZ. They're carrying RPGs and heavy weapons." Chun adjusted his binoculars and confirmed what Santos had spotted. This wasn't just a simple ambush, it was a carefully planned massacre. The enemy had known exactly when and where the SEALs would arrive, and they had prepared accordingly. The first shots rang out at 0847 hours. Morrison's team had just reached the compound when automatic weapons fire erupted from every direction. The Taliban fighters had turned the entire valley into a killing field, with overlapping fields of fire that made movement in any direction deadly. "Contact! Contact! We're taking heavy fire from all sides." Morrison's voice crackled over the radio as his team dove for cover behind a low stone wall. Bullets whined overhead, chipping chunks of rock from their meager shelter. Chief Martinez's element was pinned down behind a cluster of boulders, unable to move without exposing themselves to enemy fire. Thompson's overwatch position had been compromised within seconds, forcing his team to scramble for better cover as RPG rounds exploded around them. The situation deteriorated rapidly. The SEALs found themselves trapped in a natural amphitheater of death, with enemy fighters positioned on the high ground all around them. Their ammunition was limited, and with no immediate extraction possible, they would have to fight their way out or die trying. Santos could hear the battle raging across the valley through a radio headset. The desperation in the voices of these elite warriors was something she had never experienced before. These were men who had faced impossible odds countless times and always found a way to survive, but now even they sounded genuinely frightened. "Chun, get on the radio to base," Santos ordered. "Tell them we have friendlies under heavy fire and request immediate air support. Then start calling out targets for me." As Chun frantically worked the radio, Santos began the methodical process of ranging her targets. The enemy fighters were positioned at extreme range, over 1,200 meters away, but that was well within her capabilities. What made this situation different was the sheer number of targets and the fact that every shot had a count. The first enemy fighter she targeted was manning a heavy machine gun that was pouring devastating fire down on Morrison's position. Santos controlled her breathing, felt her heartbeat slow, and gently squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber round traveled across the valley in less than 2 seconds, finding its mark with devastating effect. The machine gun fell silent. For Morrison and his men, that single shot was like a ray of hope piercing through the darkness of their desperate situation. Someone was out there helping them, but they had no idea who it was or where the shot had come from. Santos didn't pause to admire her work. Chin was already calling out the next target, an RPG team that was preparing to fire on the pinned-down SEALs. She adjusted her aim, compensated for the wind that had picked up slightly, and fired again. Another direct hit. The battle for survival had begun, and a young Marine sniper had just announced her presence on the battlefield in the most decisive way possible. But with dozens of enemy fighters still in position and the SEALs running dangerously low on ammunition, this fight was far from over. As Santos prepared for her third shot, she realized that the next few hours would test every skill she had ever learned and push her beyond the limits of what she thought was possible. The lives of 12 elite warriors now rested in her hands, and failure was not an option. The sound of Santos' rifle echoed across the valley like thunder, and, with each shot, another enemy fighter fell. But the Taliban forces were far from defeated. If anything, the accurate sniper fire seemed to enrage them, and they began to rain down even heavier fire on the trapped SEALs while simultaneously trying to locate the source of the devastating long-range shots. Morrison pressed himself against the crumbling stone wall as bullets whined overhead. His team had already used half their ammunition, and the situation was becoming more desperate by the minute. The compound they had been sent to assault was clearly empty. This entire mission had been designed to lure them into a trap. "Chief, what's your status?" Morrison called over the radio to Martinez. "We're pinned down hard, sir," came the reply. "Rodriguez took one in the leg, and we're down to our last few magazines. Whatever Angel is shooting for us, tell him to keep it up." Meanwhile, Santos was operating in a zone of pure concentration that she had never experienced before. Everything else in the world had ceased to exist except for her rifle, her targets, and the desperate voices of the SEALs crackling through her radio. She had already eliminated 6 enemy fighters, but Chin's count showed at least 30 more still in position. "Maria, you're drawing attention," Chin warned as he spotted muzzle flashes from enemy weapons turning in their direction. "They're starting to figure out where we are." Santos nodded grimly. It was inevitable that the enemy would eventually triangulate her position. The .50 caliber rifle created a distinctive muzzle flash and sound signature that experienced fighters could track. But she couldn't stop shooting. The moment she did, the SEALs would be overwhelmed. Her radio crackled with an incoming transmission from FOB Chapman. "Overwatch, this is base. We have your request for air support, but the nearest assets are 20 minutes out. Can you hold position?" 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Santos knew that the SEALs wouldn't last another 5 minutes without continued fire support. She keyed her radio and responded with a calmness that surprised even herself. "Base, this is Overwatch. Negative on holding position. We have 12 friendlies pinned down and taking heavy casualties. I'm going to continue engaging targets until relieved or eliminated." There was a pause on the radio before the base commander responded. "Understood, Overwatch. Give them hell." Santos had been trained to operate as part of a team, to follow orders, and to work within the established chain of command. But sometimes situations arise that require individuals to step beyond their training and trust their instincts. This was one of those moments. She shifted her position slightly to get a better angle on a group of fighters who were attempting to flank Thompson's element. These weren't random shots anymore. Each bullet had to serve a specific tactical purpose. She was essentially conducting a one-person battle from over a mile away, using her rifle to direct the flow of the entire engagement. The 7th shot took out a fighter who was preparing to launch an RPG at Morrison's position. The 8th eliminated a machine gunner who had been keeping Martinez's team pinned down. With each enemy fighter that fell, the SEALs gained a little more breathing room, a little more hope. But Santos was facing a problem that no amount of training could have prepared her for. She was running low on ammunition. Each .50 caliber round was precious, and she had started the day with only 40 rounds total. Nearly a quarter of her ammunition was already gone, and the battle showed no signs of ending soon. "David, how many rounds do we have left?" she asked Chun without taking her eye from the scope. Chun quickly inventoried their ammunition. 32 rounds of .50 cal, plus whatever's in Williams' pack. Williams, who had been maintaining communications with the base, crawled over with his own ammunition count. "About another 20 rounds, but that's it. After that, we're down to small arms." Santos did the math in her head. 52 rounds to eliminate at least 30 enemy fighters while maintaining fire support for the SEALs until air support arrived. It was possible, but it would require perfect accuracy and no wasted shots. The pressure was unlike anything she had ever experienced. In training, missing a target meant doing push-ups or running extra laps. Here, every missed shot could mean the death of an American warrior. The weight of responsibility would have crushed most people, but Santos had been preparing for this moment her entire life. Her 9th shot eliminated a sniper who had been trying to get a bead on one of the SEAL positions. The 10th took out another RPG team. But as Santos worked, the enemy was adapting to her tactics. They began moving more carefully, using smoke grenades to obscure their positions, and coordinating their movements to make targeting more difficult. Morrison's voice came over the radio, filled with a mixture of hope and desperation. "Unknown shooter, this is SEAL Team 6. We don't know who you are, but you're keeping us alive out here. Our call sign is Hammer. What's yours?" Santos hesitated for a moment before responding. Military protocol discouraged individual recognition during active operations, but these circumstances were far from normal. "Hammer, this is Guardian Angel. I've got eyes on your position and will maintain fire support as long as possible." "Guardian Angel, you're living up to your call sign," Morrison replied. "We're going to try to consolidate positions and push toward the ridge line. Can you provide cover for our movement?" This was exactly the kind of tactical coordination that Santos had trained for, but never under such extreme circumstances. She would need to time her shots perfectly to suppress enemy fire during the SEALs' movement, while conserving ammunition for the continuing battle. "Copy that, Hammer. On my mark, Alpha Element move first. I'll suppress the northern positions." Santos lined up her shot on a cluster of enemy fighters positioned on a rocky outcrop that overlooked the SEALs' planned route. She controlled her breathing, steady and deep, letting her heart rate slow despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Mark," she called over the radio, and squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber round struck the rocks where the enemy fighters were positioned, sending deadly fragments in all directions and forcing them to take cover. Morrison's four-man team immediately began their movement, using the momentary suppression to bound from cover to cover toward better positions. But the enemy wasn't going to give up easily. As soon as Morrison's team began moving, fighters from other positions opened up with everything they had. Santos found herself shooting as fast as she could reload, trying to suppress multiple positions simultaneously. Her 11th shot took out a fighter with an AK-47. The 12th eliminated another RPG gunner. The 13th found its mark on a machine gun position that had been raking Morrison's team with fire. Each shot required instantaneous decision-making. Which target posed the greatest immediate threat to the SEALs? Chun was now serving as more than just a spotter. He had become Santos' tactical coordinator, helping her prioritize targets and calling out threats as they developed. "Maria, we've got movement on the eastern ridge. Looks like they're trying to set up a flanking position." Santos swiveled her rifle toward the new threat. Through her scope, she could see enemy fighters moving along the ridge line, carrying what appeared to be a recoilless rifle, a weapon capable of devastating the SEALs' positions with a single well-placed shot. This shot would be her most difficult yet. The targets were moving, partially concealed by rocks, and at the extreme edge of her rifle's effective range. Wind conditions had also changed as the day progressed, adding another variable to her calculations. She tracked the lead fighter through her scope, leading him slightly to account for his movement. The mathematics of long-range shooting flowed through her mind automatically. Range, wind speed, and direction, target movement, bullet drop, even the rotation of the Earth itself at this distance. The shot felt perfect the moment she pulled the trigger. The heavy bullet reached its target just as the fighter was setting up the recoilless rifle, eliminating both the immediate threat and the weapon itself. "Incredible shot," Chen whispered in amazement. Even Williams, who had been focused on his radio equipment, looked up in awe at what he had just witnessed. But Santos wasn't thinking about the difficulty of the shot or the praise from her teammates. She was already scanning for the next target, knowing that every second of delay could cost lives. The battle was far from over, and she still had 28 more American warriors counting on her to get them home alive. The radio crackled again with Morrison's voice, now carrying a note of genuine amazement. "Guardian Angel, I don't know what kind of training you've had, but that was the most incredible piece of shooting I've ever witnessed. You just saved all our lives." Santos keyed her radio, her voice steady despite the pressure. "Just doing my job, Hammer. We're going to get you out of there." But even as she spoke those words, Santos knew that the hardest part of the battle was still ahead. The enemy was adapting to her tactics, air support was still 15 minutes away, and her ammunition supply was dwindling rapidly. The next hour would test every skill she had ever learned and push her beyond the limits of human endurance. The mid-morning sun had climbed higher in the sky, making the already difficult shooting conditions even more challenging. Heat shimmer was beginning to rise from the rocky terrain, creating optical distortions that made target acquisition more difficult. Santos wiped sweat from her brow and adjusted her position slightly to account for the changing light conditions. Morrison's team had successfully reached better cover, but Chief Martinez's element was still pinned down in an exposed position. Rodriguez, the wounded SEAL, was losing blood steadily, and the team's medic was unable to properly treat him under the constant enemy fire. The situation was becoming critical. "Guardian Angel, this is Hammer." Morrison's voice crackled over the radio. "We need to get Martinez's team out of their position. Rodriguez needs immediate medical attention." Santos studied the tactical situation through her scope. Martinez's team was trapped behind a cluster of boulders with enemy positions on 3 sides. Any attempt to move would expose them to devastating crossfire. She would need to eliminate multiple targets in rapid succession to create a safe corridor for their movement. "Hammer, I count 8 confirmed enemy positions with overlapping fields of fire on Bravo Element's position. I can suppress them, but the window will be narrow. Your team will need to move fast." "Understood. On your mark." Santos began the most challenging sequence of shooting in her military career. She would need to eliminate or suppress 8 different targets within a span of less than 2 minutes, all while conserving ammunition for the continuing battle. Each shot would need to be perfect because there would be no time for corrections. Her first target was a machine gunner positioned on an elevated rock formation. The fighter had been pouring sustained fire onto Martinez's position, keeping them effectively pinned down. Santos calculated the range at 1,350 meters, a long shot even under ideal conditions. She controlled her breathing, feeling her pulse slow to a steady rhythm. Through the scope, she could see the enemy fighter clearly, his attention focused entirely on the trapped SEALs below. Santos squeezed the trigger with the smooth, steady pressure that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. The shot was perfect. The machine gun fell silent instantly. Without pausing, Santos swiveled her rifle toward the second target, an RPG team that had been preparing to fire on Martinez's position. These fighters were more alert now, having heard the crack of her rifle and seen their comrade fall. They were beginning to move, making the shot more difficult. Santos led the moving target slightly and fired. The second enemy fighter dropped, and the RPG clattered uselessly down the rocky slope. "Move now," Santos called over the radio as she shifted to her third target. Martinez's team began their desperate dash from cover, carrying the wounded Rodriguez between them. Enemy fighters immediately opened fire from the remaining positions, forcing the SEALs to zigzag across the open ground while bullets whined around them. Santos was now shooting faster than she ever had before, but each shot remained carefully aimed and deliberate. Her third shot eliminated a sniper who had been trying to lead the moving SEALs. Her fourth took out another machine gunner. Her fifth found its mark on a fighter with an AK-47 who had been firing from a concealed position behind a rock outcropping. But the enemy was adapting to her tactics. As soon as she fired, they began moving to new positions, making her job exponentially more difficult. Some fighters had begun using smoke grenades to obscure their movements, while others were coordinating their fire to force her to choose between multiple equally dangerous targets. Chen's voice was urgent beside her. "Maria, we've got movement on our flanks. They're trying to get close enough to use mortars on us." Santos realized that her success had made her team a primary target. The enemy had finally figured out approximately where the devastating sniper fire was coming from, and they were moving to eliminate the threat. Soon, she would be fighting for her own survival as well as that of the SEALs. "How many?" she asked Chun while continuing to scan for targets through her scope. "At least a dozen fighters moving up the south face of our position. They'll be in mortar range in about 10 minutes. This added a new dimension to an already impossible situation. Santos would need to continue providing fire support for the SEALs while simultaneously preparing to defend her own position. The mathematics of the situation were becoming overwhelmingly complex. Her radio crackled with an update from FOB Chapman. "Guardian Angel, this is base. Air support is still 10 minutes out. Can you maintain your position?" Santos looked at her ammunition count. She was down to 37 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, with enemy fighters closing on her position from multiple directions. The honest answer was that her position was becoming untenable, but honesty wasn't what the 12 trap SEALs needed to hear right now. "Base, this is Guardian Angel. Position is secure. We'll maintain fire support until relieved." It was a lie, but sometimes lies are necessary to maintain morale in desperate situations. Santos knew that the moment the SEALs lost hope, they would begin making the kind of tactical mistakes that get people killed. Martinez's team had successfully reached better cover, and the medic was now working on Rodriguez's wound. But Thompson's Overwatch element was now taking heavy fire from a new group of enemy fighters who had moved into elevated positions during the chaos. "Guardian Angel, this is Charlie Element." Thompson's voice was strained with exhaustion and stress. "We're taking heavy fire from the northwest ridge. Count at least 6 hostiles with automatic weapons." Santos swiveled her rifle toward Thompson's position and immediately saw the problem. A group of Taliban fighters had occupied a rocky outcrop that provided them with excellent fields of fire onto the SEAL positions. They were well concealed and disciplined, firing in coordinated bursts to maximize their effectiveness. This would require a different approach. Instead of trying to eliminate all 6 fighters individually, Santos decided to target the rocky overhang they were using for cover. A well-placed .50 caliber round could potentially cause a rockfall that would eliminate multiple targets simultaneously. She studied the geological formation through her scope, looking for the exact point where the overhang was most vulnerable. The shot would need to be precise, too high, and she would miss the structural weak point too low, and the bullet would simply impact harmlessly against solid rock. Santos found her target, a narrow crack in the rock face that appeared to be a natural stress point. She adjusted her scope for the range and wind conditions, then took a deep breath and fired. The heavy bullet struck exactly where she had aimed, and the results exceeded even her expectations. The entire rock overhang collapsed in a cascade of stone and dust, eliminating the enemy position completely and sending surviving fighters scrambling for new cover. "Jesus Christ." Thompson's amazed voice came over the radio. "Guardian Angel, did you just bring down half the mountain?" But Santos was already moving to her next target. Chun had spotted enemy fighters setting up a mortar position that would be able to reach both the SEAL positions and her own location. This was perhaps the most critical threat yet. Mortars could eliminate multiple targets with each round and would give the enemy a significant tactical advantage. The mortar team was positioned at extreme range, nearly 1,500 meters away and partially concealed behind a low stone wall. Santos would need to make a perfect shot on a target she could barely see, while under time pressure that would have broken most snipers. She adjusted her scope to maximum magnification and studied the target area carefully. She could see occasional movement behind the wall, but not enough to get a clear shot at any individual fighter. Instead, she would need to target the mortar itself. A much smaller target, but one that would eliminate the entire team's effectiveness if she could hit it. Through her scope, Santos caught a brief glimpse of the mortar tube as the crew adjusted its position. She had perhaps 2 seconds to make the shot before it disappeared behind cover again. There would be no time for careful calculation or multiple range adjustments. Instinct and training took over. Santos' finger found the trigger and squeezed smoothly, firing on pure muscle memory and intuition. The shot felt good the moment it left the barrel, and her confidence was rewarded when she saw the distinctive explosion of a mortar round detonating in its own tube. The enemy mortar team had been eliminated, but Santos realized that she was now down to 32 rounds with at least 20 enemy fighters still active on the battlefield. The mathematics were becoming impossible, even for someone of her exceptional skill. Chen's voice interrupted her calculations. "Maria, we've got serious problems. The fighters moving up our south face are less than 5 minutes away, and I can see muzzle flashes from at least 3 different positions." Santos made a decision that would define the rest of the battle. Instead of conserving ammunition for a defensive fight around her own position, she would continue providing fire support for the SEALs until the very last moment. When the enemy fighters finally reached her position, she would switch to her sidearm and fight them at close range. It was essentially a suicide mission, but it was the only way to ensure that the SEALs had enough time for air support to arrive. Santos keyed her radio one more time, her voice steady despite the desperate nature of her situation. "Hammer, this is Guardian Angel. I'm going to continue fire support for as long as possible. When I go silent, air support should be less than 5 minutes out." Morrison's response carried a note of understanding and respect that transcended military rank and protocol. "Guardian Angel, it's been an honor serving with you." Santos smiled grimly as she lined up her next shot. The honor, she knew, was all hers. She was about to discover what it truly meant to be a guardian angel for her fellow warriors. The sound of enemy fighters climbing the rocky slope below Santos' position was now audible without the aid of equipment. Their voices carried on the wind as they coordinated their assault on what they had finally identified as the source of the devastating sniper fire that had been decimating their ranks. Santos continued to provide fire support for the SEALs while simultaneously preparing for close combat. Williams had moved to the southern edge of their position with his M4 carbine, ready to engage the approaching enemy fighters. Chen remained beside Santos, still calling out targets, but also preparing his own weapon for the inevitable assault on their position. The tactical situation had evolved into something that no military manual had ever adequately covered. Santos was simultaneously conducting precision long-range engagements while preparing for close-quarters battle, all while running dangerously low on ammunition and facing overwhelming odds. Her 21st shot eliminated another machine gunner who had been suppressing Thompson's element. The 22nd took out an RPG gunner who had been preparing to fire on Morrison's new position. Each shot bought the SEALs a few more precious minutes, but Santos could hear enemy fighters getting closer with each passing moment. "Contact front." Williams' voice cut through the radio chatter as he opened fire on the first enemy fighters to reach their position. The distinctive crack of 5.5 6mm rounds echoed off the rocks as Williams engaged targets at close range. Santos found herself in the surreal situation of providing sniper support for trapped SEALs over a mile away, while her own position came under direct assault. She fired her 23rd shot at a distant target, then immediately grabbed her M9 pistol as enemy fighters appeared among the rocks to her left. The next few minutes were a blur of violence and chaos that would be burned into the memory of everyone who survived it. Santos was switching between her sniper rifle and her pistol, engaging targets at ranges varying from over 1,000 meters to less than 10 feet. Chun and Williams were fighting desperately to hold the perimeter, while Santos continued her impossible dual mission. An enemy fighter appeared from behind a boulder less than 20 meters away, his AK-47 swinging towards Santos' position. She smoothly drew her pistol and double-tapped him with 2 rounds to the chest before he could fire. Without pausing, she immediately returned to her rifle scope to engage a distant target that Chun had called out. "Maria, we can't hold this position much longer," Williams shouted as he reloaded his rifle. "They're coming up the east face, too." Santos realized that she was facing the defining moment of her military career. She could abandon her sniper position and focus entirely on the close-range fight for survival, which would give her team a better chance of holding their ground until air support arrived. But doing so would leave the SEALs without fire support at the most critical moment of their own battle. The decision required no conscious thought. Santos had volunteered for this deployment to protect her fellow service members, and she would continue that mission until her last breath. She keyed her radio one final time. "Hammer, this is Guardian Angel. Taking heavy contact at my position, but will maintain fire support as long as possible. Air support should be 3 minutes out." Morrison's response was immediate and filled with desperation. "Guardian Angel, break contact and preserve your team. You've done more than enough." But Santos was already lining up her 24th shot, this one at a sniper who had been trying to get a bead on Martinez's wounded team member. The shot was more difficult than usual because she could hear enemy fighters scrambling across the rocks directly behind her position, but her focus remained absolute. The bullet found its mark, and another enemy sniper was eliminated. Chen had now joined the close-range fight, his rifle barking steadily as he engaged multiple targets among the rocks. The enemy fighters were showing remarkable courage in their assault, climbing directly into rifle fire to reach the Marine sniper position that had been causing them such devastating losses. Santos fired her 25th shot at a distant machine gun position, then spun around to engage an enemy fighter who had appeared at the edge of their perimeter. Her pistol bucked twice in her hands, and the threat was eliminated. She immediately returned to her rifle scope, scanning for the next long-range target. This impossible juggling act between precision long-range shooting and close-quarters combat required a level of mental compartmentalization that few warriors possess. Santos was operating in a zone of pure tactical instinct, her conscious mind somehow managing multiple complex tasks simultaneously while her body moved with fluid efficiency. Williams had been forced back from the southern perimeter, and enemy fighters were now within grenade range of Santos' position. She could hear the distinctive metallic sound of a grenade pin being pulled, followed by Chen's urgent shout of warning. "Grenade!" Santos dropped flat behind her rocky parapet just as the explosive detonated 20 feet away. Shrapnel whined overhead, and the concussion left her ears ringing, but she was uninjured. She immediately returned to her firing position and sent her 26 shot downrange at a target that Chun had identified. The enemy was now close enough that she could hear individual voices shouting commands in Pashto. They were coordinating a final assault on her position, probably planning to overwhelm the 3 Marines through sheer numbers. Santos realized that she had perhaps 2 more minutes before the position would be overrun. But 2 minutes was enough time for 6 more shots, and 6 more shots could potentially save the lives of the SEALs who were still fighting for survival in the valley below. Santos made the conscious decision to continue her sniper mission until the very last possible moment. Her 27th shot eliminated an RPG gunner who had been preparing to fire on Thompson's element. The 28th took out another machine gunner who had been keeping Morrison's team pinned down. Each shot was becoming more difficult as smoke and dust from the close-range battle obscured her view, but Santos adapted to the conditions with the skill of a true master marksman. Chen's rifle had fallen silent, and Santos glanced over to see her spotter slumped against a rock, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. He was still conscious and tried to reload his weapon, but his dominant arm was no longer functional. "David's hit," Williams called out as he continued engaging targets to the east. "We need to move." But there was nowhere to move. The enemy had surrounded their position on 3 sides, and the only escape route led down a cliff face that would be suicide to attempt under fire. Santos realized that they were going to make their final stand right here, in this rocky outcrop that had become both fortress and tomb. Her 29th shot found its mark on a distant target, but Santos was now down to just 3 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. The mathematics were finally becoming impossible, even for her. There were still at least a dozen enemy fighters in the valley, plus the unknown number assault her own position. The radio crackled with an incoming transmission that changed everything. "All units, this is Reaper 1-1. We have eyes on target area and are beginning our attack run." Air support had finally arrived. Santos looked up from her scope to see a 10 Thunderbolt aircraft diving toward the valley, their massive GU, 8 cannons beginning to spin up for their devastating attack runs. The distinctive whine of the aircraft's engines was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. But even with air support beginning their runs, the enemy fighters around her position weren't going to give up easily. They had come too far and lost too many comrades to retreat now. The assault on Santos' position continued with desperate intensity. She fired her 30th shot at a distant target, knowing that she had only 2 rounds left. The decision of how to use those final bullets would determine whether she had truly fulfilled her mission as the guardian angel for Hammer Team. Through her scope, Santos could see Morrison's team beginning to move toward an extraction point that the A-10s were clearing with their cannon fire. But there was still one enemy position that could potentially engage the SEALs during their movement, a machine gun nest that was positioned outside the aircraft's immediate attack zone. Santos lined up what would likely be her final long-range shot of the battle. The range was extreme, over 1,400 meters, and her position was now under direct, small arms fire from enemy fighters who were less than 50 meters away. The shot would require every bit of skill and courage she possessed. She controlled her breathing one last time, feeling her heartbeat slow despite the chaos erupting around her. Through the scope, she could see the enemy machine gunner clearly, his weapon trained on the route the SEALs would need to use to reach safety. Santos squeezed the trigger, sending her 31st bullet across the valley on what she knew would be one of the most important shots of her military career. The heavy round found its target with perfect precision, eliminating the final threat to the SEALs' extraction. With 1 bullet remaining and enemy fighters now within 20 meters of her position, Santos faced the ultimate test of her commitment to her fellow warriors. She could save that final round for her own defense, or she could use it to ensure that the SEALs reach safety. For Maria Santos, there was never really a choice to be made. The A-10 Thunderbolts were methodically destroying enemy positions throughout the valley, their devastating 30mm cannons turning the tide of battle in a matter of minutes. But for Santos and her team, trapped on their rocky outcrop with enemy fighters closing from all sides, salvation still seemed impossibly distant. Santos held her final .50 caliber round in her hand, feeling the weight of the brass, and lead that represented her last chance to influence the battle from long range. Through her scope, she could see the SEALs moving toward their extraction point, but there was still one more threat that could endanger their escape. A group of enemy fighters had taken shelter in a cave complex that was outside the A-10's attack zone. They were positioned to ambush the SEALs during their movement to the landing zone, and their concealed position made them nearly impossible for the aircraft to target effectively. Santos made the decision that would define her legacy as a warrior. She lined up her final long-range shot, not on the enemy fighters who were about to overrun her own position, but on the distant threat that could kill the men she had sworn to protect. The shot was impossibly difficult. The range was at the absolute limit of her rifle's capabilities. The target was partially concealed in shadows, and she was now taking direct fire from enemy fighters who were less than 30 meters away. Bullet impacts were chipping rock around her position, and the sound of automatic weapons fire was deafening. But in that moment, Santos achieved the perfect calm that separates great snipers from merely good ones. The chaos around her faded into background noise as her entire world narrowed down to the view through her scope. She could see her target clearly, an enemy fighter with an RPG who was preparing to fire on the moving SEALs. The mathematics of a shot flowed through her mind automatically. Range, wind speed, target movement, bullet drop, even the Coriolis effect at this extreme distance. Her finger found the trigger and applied pressure with the smooth, steady squeeze that had been drilled into her through thousands of hours of training. The shot was perfect. Her final bullet traveled across the valley and found its mark with devastating precision, eliminating the RPG gunner and ensuring that the SEALs could reach their extraction point safely. Santos had fired her 32nd and final long-range shot of the battle, and it had counted when it mattered most. With her sniper rifle now empty, Santos immediately transitioned to her sidearm as enemy fighters appeared among the rocks around her position. The close-range battle that followed would test every aspect of her combat training, but it would be fought with the satisfaction of knowing that she had completed her mission. Williams was down to his last magazine, and Chen was barely conscious from his shoulder wound. The three Marines were about to be overrun by overwhelming numbers, but they had held their position long enough to ensure that 12 Navy SEALs would live to fight another day. Santos fired her pistol with methodical precision, each shot carefully aimed despite the desperate circumstances. An enemy fighter appeared from behind a boulder 15 meters away, and she double-tapped him with 2 rounds to the chest. Another fighter tried to rush her position from the left, and she engaged him with 3 quick shots that dropped him immediately. But there were simply too many enemy fighters, and they were coming from too many directions. Santos realized that she was about to face the ultimate test of her courage. Not the courage to take life, but the courage to give her own life for her fellow warriors. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice, now transmitted from the relative safety of the extraction zone. Guardian Angel, Hammer Team is secure at the LZ. You save our lives out there. Santos smiled as she reloaded her pistol, knowing that those words made everything she had endured worthwhile. The mission had been successful. 12 elite warriors would return home to their families because of what she and her team had accomplished here today. But the battle wasn't over yet. The sound of rotor blades suddenly filled the air as a pair of Apache attack helicopters crested the ridgeline. The cavalry had arrived in the form of 2 of the most deadly aircraft ever designed, and they immediately began engaging the enemy fighters who had surrounded Santos' position. The Apache helicopters were equipped with 30mm chain guns and Hellfire missiles, and they used both weapon systems to devastating effect. Enemy fighters who had been advancing on Santos' position were suddenly forced to take cover as high-explosive rounds began detonating around them. Marine Sniper Team, this is Apache 1-1, a voice crackled over Santos' radio. We have eyes on your position and are engaging hostiles in your immediate area. Can you mark your position? Santos popped a smoke grenade to mark her team's location, then continued engaging targets with her pistol while the Apaches worked to clear the area. The psychological effect of the helicopter attack was as important as the physical destruction. Enemy fighters who had been advancing with fanatical determination suddenly found themselves under attack from the sky by weapons they had no way to counter. The tide of the close-range battle turned quickly. Enemy fighters began withdrawing from Santos' position, some carrying wounded comrades, while others simply fled into the mountains to escape the devastating helicopter attack. Within 10 minutes, the immediate threat to Santos' team had been eliminated. Chen was evacuated by medical helicopter within the hour, his shoulder wound requiring surgery, but not life-threatening. Williams emerged from the battle physically uninjured, but mentally exhausted by the intensity of the fight. Santos herself had sustained only minor cuts from rock fragments, though the psychological impact of what she had experienced would take much longer to process. The official after-action report listed the battle as a successful counter-ambush operation, resulting in the elimination of 42 enemy fighters and the rescue of 12 friendly personnel. The report mentioned that long-range sniper support proved decisive in the engagement, but it failed to capture the human drama of what had actually occurred. 3 days later, Lieutenant Commander Morrison visited Santos at the forward operating base. The tough SEAL officer seemed almost uncomfortable as he struggled to find words adequate to express his gratitude. Sergeant Santos, he began, then stopped and started over. Maria, I've been in special operations for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like what you did out there. You saved 12 lives with some of the most incredible shooting I've ever witnessed. Santos responded with the quiet professionalism that had characterized her entire military career. I was just doing my job, sir. Same as you and your team. But Morrison shook his head. No, what you did was far beyond any job description. You risked your own life repeatedly to save ours, and you did it with a level of skill and courage that redefined what I thought was possible. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a courier with official orders. Santos had been awarded the Silver Star for her actions during the battle, making her one of only a handful of female Marines to receive such recognition for combat valor. The citation read, in part, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against an armed enemy while serving as a sniper team leader during combat operations in Afghanistan. But for Santos, the real reward was much simpler. She had done what she had trained her entire career to do: protect her fellow warriors when they needed it most. The medals and citations were nice, but they weren't why she had volunteered for this deployment or why she had chosen to stay in her exposed position until the very last moment. 6 months later, Santos was back home in Texas, visiting her grandfather's ranch where she had first learned to shoot as a child. The old man listened quietly as she told him about the battle, occasionally nodding, but mostly just letting her talk through the experience. Sounds like you did good, granddaughter, he said finally. Sounds like you did exactly what needed doing. Santos looked out across the familiar landscape of her childhood, remembering the young girl who had dreamed of serving her country and protecting others. That girl had grown up to become a guardian angel for warriors in their darkest hour, proving that heroes don't always wear capes or have special powers. Sometimes they just have steady hands, sharp eyes, and the courage to do what's right when everything is on the line. The story of Sergeant Maria Santos and her 32 shots that saved 12 lives became legend within certain military circles, though the details remained classified for years. It was a story about the power of individual courage, the importance of superior training, and the bonds that connect all warriors regardless of rank, gender, or service branch. But, most importantly, it was a story about what it truly means to be a guardian angel. Not a mythical being with wings and supernatural powers, but a flesh and blood human being who chooses to put others before themselves when lives hang in the balance. In the mountains of Afghanistan, on a clear September morning, when 42 enemy fighters thought they had trapped 12 American warriors, a 24-year-old Marine sniper proved that angels don't always have wings. Sometimes they have rifle scopes and the skill to use them when it matters most. The legend of Guardian Angel lives on, inspiring new generations of warriors who understand that the greatest victories are not won by those who seek personal glory, but by those who stand ready to sacrifice everything for their brothers and sisters in arms. Maria Santos returned home with her head held high, knowing that when her moment of testing came, she had not been found wanting. And somewhere in the mountains of Afghanistan, 12 families got to welcome their warriors home, because one young woman understood that being a guardian angel isn't about having supernatural powers. It's about having the courage to use the powers you do have when others need you most.